Perfect. Yes. Great. And yeah. So I wanted to start by acknowledging the fact that we are on stolen land. It's not super funny. The Kanyankhaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations peoples. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples, and we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other communities in Montreal. So beyond simply acknowledging the fact that we're on stolen land today, we encourage you and ourselves to consider our continued occupation of colonized First Nations lands, question our colonial histories and their legacies, and reflect on our own complicity within the perpetuation of colonial and oppressive systems. And so this is of particular importance every day, but especially today, because it's the 13th annual March and Vigil for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so in the spirit of reconciliation, we're asking for donations for a reparations for Two-Spirit trans Indigenous people in Montreal. And if you have cash and you can donate, we've got a donation box at the front, which I really encourage you to do because this is happening today. And if you want the link to donate directly, you can speak to me after the talk. So when I started, when I made the decision to become a designer, I brought with me the conviction that design did something more than just aesthetic work. And this feeling was particularly grounded in my experience growing up in a small town in Ontario as a queer person and feeling relatively isolated and alone in that sort of environment. And so coming into consciousness with, in tandem with the proliferation of the internet, much of my socialization occurred through the means of network technologies. And it was in these virtual spaces that I first encountered other queer people expressing themselves outside of oppressive frameworks that constituted my embodied reality. I saw proto-trans kids on YouTube proudly teaching their thousands of followers how to create the perfect smoky eye. I saw queers on Tumblr using clothing as a means of resistance to expected models of gendered presentation. I saw thousands of LGBTQ two-spirited plus people all across the world organizing in the streets in protest of oppressive governments, holding signs that communicated complex sentiments in 10 words or less. These representations, aided by multiple forms of design, underscored by digital technology, fortified me, and I don't think it would be overdramatic to say that it very much saved my life to see these representations on the internet in an environment where I didn't have access to other queer people. So when I was lucky enough to move to Montreal to be surrounded by communities of queer people, still my relationships were mediated vis-a-vis technology. So this is an image of the now defunct, thanks to the fucked up FOSTA SESTA bill, Craigslist Casual Encounters, which was the means through which I had many of my first sexual experiences. Another digital platform, Gay 411, and now Grindr. And so I articulate this sort of this relationship to the internet in terms of underscoring a particularly queer way of relating to the internet and the work that the internet does for queer people, or at least in my experience. So shifting into another story, which is the story of Queering the Map, the project that I'm here to talk about today. So it all started on a bike ride. I was biking home from school one fall evening, and I bike by this tree in Parc Jean Mance every day to and from school. And at this tree is where I met my first long-term partner. And so it's a moment of, or a space that's sort of animated by queer joy and queer futurity and queer excitement. And it's also the space where I had a pretty significantly challenging conversation with that partner about my non-binary gender. And so this tree at once holds a positive memory of queerness and something that's more on the negative side of the spectrum. And so as I continued my bike ride, I started to think about all of the other places that held this kind of nuanced queer experience to me, that grounded me in a physical relationship to my queerness rather than one that was mediated vis-a-vis digital technologies. So one of those spaces is the mysterious red shipping container by my childhood home, where the first person that I was in love with, and I would meet to discuss our relationship and the barriers to it, as at that point in time he was not out, to the baseball field in Parc Laurier, where in the summer, not in the winter, but this was the image that Google Maps Street View provides us, I was gifted by a friend of mine this beautiful pink slip, and I danced around this baseball field, this sort of zone of normative masculinity, feeling validated in my gender queerness and supported by my friend and my community at large. To the street corner where I made out with the person that I was at that time falling in love with for 20 minutes, and that experience was sort of, it was a sort of toss-up between the excitement of falling in love with someone, also with the sort of dual experience of fearing that I would receive, or that we would receive, homophobic or transphobic remarks. And then these sort of musings are what brought me to develop Queering the Map. Ultimately, I got a little bit bored thinking about my own experiences in relationship to place, and I wanted to think about a way that I could map out those experiences. So I started to code Queering the Map, and Queering the Map is a community-generated mapping project that geolocates queer moments, memories, and histories, like the ones that I've just described, in relationship to physical space. And so the intent of the project is to leave queerness as open to interpretation as possible. So anything from profound experiences of connection to deeply traumatic experiences to the completely banal to direct action activism. Queering the Map works to function as a living community-generated archive of queer experience. And so the functionality, the user interface of the project is extremely simple. It's essentially a pink Google Maps, onto which people can click a point on the map and share a story of queer experience, however they define that, in relationship to that place. Click the add button, and then voila, it appears on the map. So I started this project about a year ago, and when I started it, it was just about 15 points of my own experience, and then I shared the project with some friends and people within my immediate community, and slowly points started to appear across Montreal specifically. And then I further developed the project during a residency at the Concordia Fine Arts Reading Room, where I set up the browser so that anytime you opened the browser and anytime that you opened a new tab, Queering the Map would pop up. So some sort of forced user interaction that was really successful. And within a sort of 6-month period during which Queering the Map was set up on these computers, the submissions went from the sort of like 15, 20, 30 of people that I knew to roughly over 600 points. So initially the points started in Montreal, and then they started to show up in Toronto, and then they started to show up in Vancouver, and then I was really excited when they started to show up in the States, and I was super, super excited when they started to show up in Australia. And then I was a little annoyed because then there were more in Australia for a certain period of time than there were in Montreal. And so by the end of this residency, there were about 600 plus points on the map. And the range in terms of experience was unbelievable. Particularly, and Australia was a particularly interesting zone in terms of articulating different political viewpoints within queer communities. So on one hand, and it sort of came into, or it was taken up during the yes vote on marriage in Australia, so there was a lot of people speaking about the win on, or the yes vote on gay marriage, and simultaneously, which is a more sort of liberal politic, and simultaneously in the same kinds of spaces, there were stories that were more rooted in a queer, anarcho, anti-assimilationist politic that wouldn't be as interested in the fight for gay marriage, and rather, uh-oh. Touch ID or enter password. Touch ID. Biometrics. Mm-mm. So when at the end of this 6-month residency, I sort of considered the project a big success. 600 points was huge. They were in more than Montreal. There were people that were participating in the project that I didn't know. And I sort of, said, good job, babe, you're done. And I was really fucking wrong. And so on February 8th, the project went viral, and it jumped in a period of 3 days from the 600 points that had occurred over the period of that residency to just over 6,500 points in a period of 3 days. And those points were all across the world. And so evidently with that kind of visibility came a significant amount of opposition. And so on the morning of February 11th, I woke up to a slew of emails alerting me to the fact that Queering the Map had been spammed by Trump supporters. And they had done a really creative job of creating multiplying pop-ups that whenever you clicked anywhere on the map, 5 pop-ups would appear, 5 points would appear that would then generate pop-ups that either said, Make America Great Again, or actually better, queeringthemap.com says, Make America Great Again, and or Donald Trump Best President. So a little discouraged, I took the site down and I posted on the URL asking if there was anyone that had, actually I believe what I asked was if there were any master coders who had the ability to help me fix this problem. And about 50 master coders materialized through the digital WordWorks. And then that sort of whittled down to about 15 people who were really committed to getting the site back online and exponentially increasing its security. Because at that point, it was, I didn't totally know what I was doing. I just sort of created the bare minimum product. And so we worked together to develop a significantly more secure platform, as well as creating a much more scalable database. And there was also the addition of a moderation panel, which prior to that I was operating from a sort of techno-utopian idea that, yeah, I mean, no one's gonna, like, what's gonna happen? It's a queer map. No, that's wrong. So we relaunched the project on April 3rd. And as of today, we've grown from the 6,500 points that occurred within that hot February 8th to February 11th moment to just over 25,000 points that span every single continent in the world. And there are posts in over 23 different languages. Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to sort of take this opportunity to speak about the ideas and the thoughts, the ideas and the theory behind the project. So I wanted to start with the question of what is queering and why is this important? And so a quick Google definition of queering leads you to a potentially problematic definition of queer, but which is an idea of queer that I think is really beneficial to think through and to work with. And so Google's immediate definition of queer is to spoil or ruin, which I think is particularly, it's perhaps negative, but I think it's a particularly powerful way of understanding queerness as something that is the intention of it, or I would take queerness as the intention is to spoil or ruin or to point out the flaws in a system that doesn't work. So the system in this case being heteronormativity and cis-normativity. And so when we take that sort of definition in thinking about what it would mean to queer space or to spoil space or ultimately to disrupt space, we can think about queering space not as something that's trying to embed a given environment with a sexual orientation or a gender identity that differs from compulsory cis heteronormativity, but rather to point out the ways in which space is manufactured or space is created predominantly to suit the needs of cis heterosexual folk, amongst many other axes of oppression, white supremacy being one of the many others. And so to sort of give a tangible example of how this sort of process of queering works and what it does as it relates to the built environment, there is a story on Queering the Map, which I think effectively sort of sums up why it would be important to, why this kind of project is important, why a sort of project that delineates a relationship to space that's different from a normative understanding. And so this is a point in Ashland in Oregon, I believe. And so it reads, working as a direct support professional for adults with developmental disabilities, I found out one of my residents wasn't cis and that their other caregivers weren't supporting or even acknowledging their identity. The main excuse they gave was a concern for the resident's safety, presenting the way they wanted to in public, especially in public bathrooms. I took a weekend of my own time and personally canvassed every single shop and restaurant downtown about whether they had gender-neutral bathrooms, or at least single occupancy locking bathrooms, the visibility of the bathrooms, whether they were customers only, etc. I've since left that job, but I see that resident around town now presenting how they want and looking so happy. So if I can analyze this point for a moment and thinking about the ways in which queering has a productive potential in terms of how people change and shift their relationships to the built environment, we have someone that is presenting in a way that differs from cis normativity, and someone else is taking up that call to arms, noticing that that person is not being greeted by the spaces in which they inhabit in a way that is wholly accepting, and then takes that queering, which we could argue is occurring by both the person who is existing as queer in the world and the person who is acknowledging that and then doing the work to make those kinds of environments safer and more accepting for that person. So we see the way in which this sort of taking up of or relating to space in a queer way has productive potential. And then another example of this from the map is in somewhere in the US. So it says, November 9th, 2016, just after Trump won the presidency, a protest gathered at this park and allowed community members to speak. I talked about how scared I was as an openly trans person of color and was immediately surrounded by other queer people just like me. I met a lot of new people that night. So this gives a really important and the sort of visual of the map of this small park somewhere in the United States, in which queer people are coming together in resistance to a government that would rather that we do not exist, and creating an ephemeral queer space that creates the kind of community that is necessary to survive the political garbage that is much of the world at the moment. Yeah, so that's sort of, I wanted to make that point at the beginning to sort of ground the political importance of this project. And now I want to sort of shift gears into thinking about what this can mean for design, and particularly what this can mean for the design of digital technologies, digital interfaces. So when I started this project, I was really invested in trying to think about these kinds of questions. What could it mean to, we can see how queer works in relationship to bodies. We can see how queerness and queering works in relationships works in relationship to spaces and bodies and communities. But how could we take this kind of framework and relate it to digital interface? And so part of this is thinking about at a baseline, if queerness, if we're to take the, half helpful, half useless definition that Google gives us, if it is to spoil and to ruin something, I think that one of the things that queerness spoils and ruins is the idea that we are knowable subjects, that we are individuals in the world that are only one thing, but rather I think queerness shows us the ways in which we are ever changing and always in relationship to other people. And so I was thinking about the ways in which social media platforms like Twitter and like Facebook and like Instagram ask for a certain amount of continued self-performance. And that the intent of these kinds of platforms is to construct a version of the self. And then on top of, and what queerness could mean in terms of disrupting that sort of individual approach to identity, but rather considering the ways in which we're co-constructed as individuals. And then further than that, I was thinking about the way in which algorithm, or the role of algorithms in how identities are constructed online. So there's a sort of linear approach to the way that we encounter social media. So a sort of queer approach to that would be to remove the algorithm, to remove a sort of top-down understanding or a top-down relationship to how we are processing and relating to information, and also to move away from a time-based notion of that and into one that's more oriented in space. And so I'm just going to throw a picture of Queering the Map on top of these very important platforms to argue that Queering the Map works as a sort of queered interface vis-a-vis the same sort of functionality of Google Maps, obviously, but that because it allows us to click through to put in relationship different sort of points that are not structured from a top-down hierarchy. So there are no algorithms on Queering the Map telling us how we are supposed to go through the stories. And I think it's particularly important, or this sort of thinking on algorithms is particularly important in thinking about where algorithms are now. We've moved away from a sort of understanding of algorithms as these sort of things, these digital things that are totally objective, and so this is an article published by MIT Media Lab with a really important question of your machine is learning, but who is teaching it? And the sort of takeaway from this that I want to hold on to is that algorithms inherit our biases. So and they say in this article that algorithms are doling out discriminatory sentence recommendations for judges to use. Algorithms are baking in gender stereotypes to translation services. Algorithms are pushing viewers towards extremist videos on YouTube. So part of the intent of Queering the Map is to move away from a platform capitalist, algorithmic-based mode of encountering the internet and into one that is much more radically open. And so I think I've been working on this project for about a year, and I've read almost every single story that's been posted to Queering the Map, and it's really hard to sort of wrap my head around, or sort of to create some sort of top-down analysis of like what this project means and what people are saying on the map. But the one thing that has come out for me in this project that I think is really speaks to why it is important is resisting or disrupting what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the single story. And I don't know if anyone has seen this TED Talk entitled "A Single Story" by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. But in it, she articulates the danger of the single story, as the title would lead you to believe. And the sort of takeaway from this is that the danger of the single story is that it shows people as one thing over and over again, and then that's what they become. It robs people of dignity, and it makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. So, So I want to sort of, so the what has become of this project, or the thing that I have really taken away, is the way that it at once sort of, that it resists Western notions of what queerness is. So there's this sort of homo-nationalist approach to construct the West as the place in which queer people are safe, and the non-West as places that, from within a homo-nationalist sort of politic, that the non-West are places where people need to be liberated. And so therefore the West is always a safe place for queer people, and the non-Western is not a safe place for queer people. So something like, and I'm going to try to demonstrate this through the points, through two sort of case studies of what have been added to the map. So for example, in Dhaka in Bangladesh, at once we have one point that reads, "I'm sorry, I don't think I can ever come back to visit all of you again. Not when there is a warrant for my murder just because of who I am, who I love, who I fight for. I face enough trouble for not dressing like a girl as it is." And so this sort of, it backs up a sort of understanding of non-Western places as always unsafe for queer people. And so if we were to take that as the single story, we would miss out on another story that is posted in Dhaka, which reads, "Rainbow Pride to remind us that Bangladesh has a history of queerness that is our own, not one co-opted by Western neoliberalism and the pink pound. Proud of ourselves and our heritage." So something like or using co-creation as a means through which to tell stories as a way of resisting a sort of singular narrative of a place and of a community in relationship to a place. And I think the same can be true in terms of resisting the West's sort of masturbatory relationship to itself, in terms of thinking, if we take Canada, for example, which definitely prides itself on its inclusion of LGBTQ people, we can see a story that really backs that up, which reads, "I was laying on your chest, wrapped in your arms, wondering how in the world I was so lucky. I looked up to see you smiling and realized that I should have been kissing you, so I did." It's a beautiful story. It promotes a sort of like non-problematic relationship that queer people have in relationship to space in a Western context, in this case in Winnipeg, while simultaneously we have a post within the same city which reads, "They held him down and ripped his earring out because he got it on the wrong side. Where I learned to be terrified of being gay. So much love to everyone who survived being queer in this city. I see you." And so I think the biggest thing that Queering the Map shows us is this sort of multiplicity that occurs in relationship to place, and again is a tool in terms of resisting singular narratives of place and singular narratives of communities in relationship to those places. And so the final point that I wanted to make in terms of refocusing on Queering the Map and the theory and the thought process behind the project is reclaiming anonymity. So I think when the internet sort of began, there was this techno-utopian perspective that was very similar to the techno-utopian perspective that I took, that nothing can ever go wrong. There could be nothing wrong with the way that this beautiful, open, democratic system has been designed, which we're now very much in a moment that I think is a bit of we're having a moment of crisis in relationship to the internet. And one of my sort of continuous projects or interests is in reclaiming anonymity and the power of anonymity away from the sort of negative ways in which we see it. So we can think about anonymity in a big way has become the sort of purview of trolls, that many platforms now ask us to really perform an identity as the way of validating ourselves as real people. And so I wanted to speak to the power of that anonymity again through a post to Queering the Map, which says, and this is located in Côte-des-Neiges in Montreal, and it reads, "I'm 13. You tell me that your friend saw me in a picture through MSN and asked who that cute boy was. I pretend to find it funny that someone thought I was a boy, but it gave me hope. It meant the world to me then, and it still does now. You probably won't remember this, but I hope you are doing well, Summer Girl," which I imagine is like an MSN username. And so this point sort of gives us insight into the power of misrecognition or the power of anonymity, that vis-a-vis this relationship between the physical body, technology, and another physical body, someone is being misread in a productive way, in a way that allows them to feel read and be seen in a way that is outside of normative gendered expectations and closer to the way in which they would like to be, or the way in which they are and need to be perceived. So there is an interview that I did with a really brilliant person from Ruthless magazine in the UK named Agad Singh. And I sort of started out the conversation that I had with this person, speaking to my own desire that I believe in the power of anonymity so much in relationship to the web. I believe in sort of moving away from a desire to produce oneself as a subject to be like recognized by the internet. That part of my desire at the beginning of this project was very much to be anonymous as well, to sort of have the project speak for itself. And so his response, I think, is one of the most beautiful reflections on the project that it has garnered so far. And so in this article, he writes, "It might sound like a strange aspiration to be anonymous. Maybe it's also strange that a project that assigns its participants blanket anonymity provides exactly the conditions necessary to give a diverse and persecuted demographic visibility. But anonymity is distinct from invisibility. It presupposes a crowd in which to lose oneself and with which to be amalgamated. Perhaps it touches on a sense of belonging that so many of us have lacked in our formative years in an othering world. In the case of Queering the Map, anonymity is the basis of our ability to become known." So now, as I pass this tree in Parc Jean Mance that served as the starting point, that served as the starting point for the project, I think not only of my connection to that memory, but to the thousands of queer experiences that have been posted to Queering the Map so far. I'm reminded of the resiliency and the diversity of our community. I'm reminded of the ways in which we are united because of and not despite our differences. I'm reminded of the work we have done and the immense amount of work that we still have to do. Most of all, I'm overcome with a profound sense of connection to the stories of people whom I do not know, but with whom I stand with in our collective fight towards a queerer, more radically accepting world. And so I want to conclude this presentation with a particularly important point that brings us back home to the fact that today is the 13th March and Vigil for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, with a point that was posted in Honolulu, Hawaii, just about 2 weeks ago. And it reads, "This school taught me a lot about what it means to be Hawaiian, to be queer, and to be both somewhere in between and somewhere not at all. The story of my people, I was told by too many teachers, left out the ancestors who loved indiscriminate of gender and even broke beyond the binaries of it. This is where I fell in love for the first time, where my heart was broken, where I learned that decolonization must mean queer liberation and that queer liberation must mean decolonization." Thank you.
Let's do a hug. Why not? Do we have any questions for Lucas? People are shy. Yes.
So now there is a moderation panel, which thankfully is not done entirely by me, but is actually Tess, who introduced me, is a moderator and has been with me through the entire project. Tatum, a friend of mine who's also here, is a moderator. But yeah, essentially we look through all of them following the Trump spam, not to curate, because the point is that everything we're sort of trying to keep what constitutes queerness as open as possible. But we don't allow things essentially that give away personal information, like full names, addresses, phone numbers, or obviously hate and spam. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you're interested in solving the problem of discovery in any way, or if you don't think that as a problem. Particularly, what strikes me is probably messages that certain people would want to read everything that's been provided.
Mm-hmm.
That might be hard to find.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely because there's this sort of I struggle with that question because there's like the design part of my mind and the sort of optimization zone in my brain, and curatorial zone in my brain that really wants to sort of drive home there's a particular political project that I'm trying to make with this project that isn't necessarily experienced if one doesn't read the points that are particularly oriented around that kind of politic. But then at the same time, I worry about a sort of like categorization, because I think it would be sort of like, if underpinning this project is also a sort of a queer methodology to put things into categories, I think would then also put silos on the way that people relate to. So it's like if you just want to read stories about like hot gay sex, you're going to miss out on all of the other not hot gay sex stories. But it is something, especially as like the numbers in the project grow, it's definitely a larger question of how to contend with both the desire to still keep it open and to not categorize, but also to be able to sort of like put the best foot forward in terms of how people interact with the project. So if you have any ideas, let me know. Thank you.
I had a question.
I'm not sure if it's part of this question because I think it's a different thing, but there was a part that was really interested about how you search in the site. And you told like it was different from the linear way we are used to.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you go there, like how do you search for the stories? Is it like alphabetical or you just go on the map or?
Yeah, so you immediately when you log onto the site, you're brought to Montreal. And so part of that is resisting, and even, I mean, the browser always takes your IP address and therefore has a general idea of your location. But I'm really trying to sort of resist, so no user data is collected in this project. So you always land in Montreal, and that might eventually change. But you land in Montreal, and then you essentially have to zoom out, scroll over to where you... Exactly. And at the moment, there's no search function. The only search function that we're currently thinking of developing is sort of place-based location. Place-based searching. So you could search for a place, but not points. Because at the moment, I'm trying to figure out what the way of resisting the sort of filtering of the stories are and trying to lead it or trying to sort of like use randomization or random encounters with the map as the mode through which people are encountering it. Thank you. Oh. Sorry. The question was how reading all of these points affect me as a person. It's a big question. I think I have a deeper respect for the variety of people's experiences, Part of my desire when I started this project was really trying to move away from a sort of like neoliberal individual entrepreneurial subject version of myself, which is like, I think, a really unhealthy way of existing in the world. So I really wanted to learn more about other people's experience and contextualize myself in relation to community rather than in relationship to myself. So it's very much been a gift for me, this project, in terms of being trusted and given the opportunity to read through people's moments of joy and people's moments of trauma. And it's a lot of work. I realized I thought it was just going to, like, one does not, and I think that Tess and Tatum, who are here, can attest to the kind of like emotional labor that occurs in terms of reading through these points. Like, you really take them on, like you really have to think through. People spend, the things that people write, I mean, I encourage like everyone, if you are interested, to go on the site and read what people write, because it's truly incredible. So yeah, it's had a profound effect on how I think about queerness and the millions of ways in which that's interpreted by people in so many different contexts.
We'll do one last question.
I was just curious if you had, like, was it intentional to choose black as a color for the pins? Because you want to, like, black out the map as, like, queer.
Yeah. Okay, so it started out as sort of an homage to like early zine, like queer zine culture, in which like black ink would be printed on pink paper, as like purely an aesthetic choice. But then I became obsessed with the fact, because part of it too is also trying to like resist homo-nationalist understandings of queer identity. So these like sort of gross and kind of like ugly, like, I mean, I get it from a design perspective that like, yeah, I should fucking cluster. But I don't want to cluster, because then it locates those stories in relation, in zooming out, it's like, there are this many points in the United States, there are this many points in Canada, there are this many points in Somalia, and it sort of, I think it gives too much of I think it would be too easy to read that as like this place good, this place bad. Whereas this sort of blurring, like with all of these like grotesque, when you zoom out far enough, black points that kind of blur queerness, I think the sort of like the message that I'm trying to bring home by never clustering is queer solidarity across borders.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much. And if you have more questions that we didn't get to, I'm sure, Lucas, you'll be sticking around, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So you can find them and ask them your questions in person.
And please
Don't forget about
consider donating. Please. Thank you.
So for donations, it's right at the table, so you won't miss it.
And if you want to donate directly,